Hi dear friends, welcome to the CSS Learners Academy. Today I am going to talk about the Minto-Morley reforms. I have divided this topic into four headings. Number one would be the background. Number second would be the motivation or the reasons of these constitutional reforms. Number third would be the structure of Indian Councils Act 1909. And number four would be the conclusion. As you know that I suggest dividing a question into 4 or 5 headings. A question usually comprises of 20 marks, and if you divide the question into 4 separate headings, it means that you should write a material of up to 5 marks in one heading, and then 5 into 4 makes it 20. So today we are going to talk about Minto-Morley reforms. A separate question cannot be asked on these reforms, but in our series of the brief history of Pakistan, I have included all the important topics that will help you in formulating your opinion regarding any question about the history of Pakistan. Now, first of all, the background. As you are aware of the fact that in the aftermath of the War of Independence of 1857, the Britishers were solely thinking about maintaining their control over the Indian subcontinent. They had several colonies under their power until that moment, but as you know that Indian subcontinent was the most important, as the Britishers themselves called is a jewel in the British crown. So, in the year following that, Britishers were trying to maintain their control more and more on the Indian subcontinent. Meanwhile, there was a kind of awareness raising among the Indian masses, the intellectuals from the Indian society who were getting the modern educations under the international education systems provided by the British, and also the local systems as we know of the Mohammedan Anglo-oriented college by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. So as this awareness was raising more and more, the Indians were demanding their rights. They were demanding their share in the government, and they were demanding their representation. At this point, they were not saying they were not against the British rule, but they were saying that their rights should be recognized and should be given to the masses. The strategy of British Crown, the strategy usually known as divide and rule, was successful in all the colonies, and that's why the same model was implemented in the Indian subcontinent. The first target of this policy was both Muslims and Hindus. After the War of Independence of 1857, Britishers were of the view that as Hindus had been living under the Muslim rule for more than 1100 years, so they might be the suppressed population. Therefore, they started encouraging Hindus more and more by giving them the rights to have a job, to enter any education institute of their choice, and to practice their religion. But as they were encouraging Hindus, they were discouraging the Muslims more and more. And because of the attitude of the Hindus, who, despite of being the neighbors of Muslims for more than 1100 years, never raised a voice. So they were easy to bribe. They were easy to be manipulated by just giving them the offers of lucrative jobs or giving them the piece of land or money. Therefore, the foundations of this concept of divide and rule were laid. Some of the Indian intellectuals, who were the activists and the lawyers, they created a group nonetheless to raise the concerns of Indians in front of the British Crown. The Indians felt that their voices have not been heard in England as it should have been. And as we know, a famous retired English civil servant, William Octavian Hume, was the one who laid the foundation of such a body known as Indian National Congress in December 1885. So the Indian National Congress, or INC, was not at first a political body, but it was a body that worked as a bridge between the British Crown and the Indian people. In the following years, the INC invited a lot of intellectuals, Dadabhai Naroji, Surendranath Banerjee, and Gopal Krishna Gokhale, and Muhammad Ali Jinnah. The next heading is the motivation or the need for the constitutional reforms. While Indian National Congress was working as a bridge between the British Crown and the Indian people, as I have mentioned earlier, some rules and regulations were already there to drive the Indian subcontinent. One of them included the Indian Consuls Act of 1862, the Penal Code of 1860, and the Code of Criminal Procedure 1898. Among these bodies of laws, the Indian Consuls Act of 1862, developed by Lord Ripon, was actually giving the Indians more and more representation, but that representation was only limited. Limited seats were given to the Indians to represent the elected personals in the legislative councils. So now Indians were demanding a better representation where they can have a say in the matters of the government regarding their homeland. The second important factor is that the Muslims felt discriminated in the Indian National Congress. Why? Because Indian National Congress was not representing the Muslims as it was required to be. It was felt that Congress is not the party of all India, but the party of a separate group of people who was trying to safeguard their own interests. The demands of the Muslims were separate electorate, and this demand was not conveyed to the British Crown. But that is not the only reason. In the year 1905, we have seen that the two important incidents happened, one on the international forum and the other one on the national forum. On the international forum, there was a war between Japan and Russia in 1905. This war is commonly known as World War Zero because it laid somehow the foundations of World War One and World War Two that would follow in the years later. Now, after that war, it was obviously catastrophic for the Russian Empire, but it also grossly impacted the colonies. The people inside the colonies, the masses, they started to rethink about living under a colonial master. And we see the mass movements in Asia and Africa and especially in the Indian subcontinent. Now, these movements, they were not only affecting the Asian and the African continent, but also had an impact on the Middle East, where the Ottoman Empire was getting weaker and weaker day by day. That was the concern of the Muslims. The second important incident happened on the national level was the partition of Bengal. Lord Curzon partitioned Bengal in the year 1905 purely because of the administrative purposes. But that division did not only divided Bengal, it divided the Indians into two clear factions, the Muslims and the Hindus. Indian National Congress, which was meant to be the representative of all the inhabitants of Indian subcontinent, they went against the decision of partition of Bengal in a pretty assertive and aggressive way. They started a mass movement of with the name of Swadeshi movement, and it continued until the annulment of that partition in 1911. Muslims felt betrayed. Muslims were a part of Indian National Congress and they demanded that things should be sorted out before going out against the British. That never happened. So in 1906, Muslims they arranged their own delegation, and in October 1906 they met the Viceroy Lord Minto in Shimla. Muslims put forwarded their own concerns, and they also demanded the separate electorate. In the 2 months, Muslims established their own political party with the name of All India Muslim League in December 1906. Now, getting familiar with the interests of both Muslims and Hindus, the Britishers were thinking more and more about the constitutional reforms. The proposals regarding the constitutional reforms for the Indian Consuls Act 1909 were already underway. So the Britishers were now aware that they had to give Indians something to make them satisfied, but that thing should be given in a way as to maintain control in their own hands. Now we will discuss the structure of the Minto-Morley reforms or the Indian Consuls Act of 1909. John Morley, Secretary of State for India, who was representing the Indian masses in the British Parliament, and Lord Minto, who was the Viceroy of India, They formulated some proposals later to be known as Indian Consuls Act of 1909. Now we will study some of these proposals. Here I would describe these proposals precisely and briefly just for the sake of information, because I will be giving another lecture on the constitutional reforms from 1862 up to 1973. Here we will discuss the three constitutions before the partition of Pakistan and the three afterwards. The Indian Consuls Acts of 1862, 1909, 1919, Government of India Act 1935, and then the Constitution of Pakistan 1956, 1962, and 1973. They will be discussed in that separate lecture regarding the constitutional reforms in the past 120 years. Here, I will try to elaborate some distinctive features or the salient features of Indian Consuls Act 1909. The British administrators maintained the central legislative assemblies at the central level and the provincial legislative assemblies at the provincial levels. For the beginners, I would like to describe it a National Assembly and the Provincial Assembly. These assemblies are basically where the people are represented through their own representative. The concept of democracy works in this way. In the area where you are living, there would be a person in that society who would say that I would look after your interest. And if he is chosen to represent his people at the provincial level, he is called as the member of provincial assembly or MPA. Whereas there is the area comprising of different provincial constituencies, and it makes a single unit represented in the National Assembly by a member which is known as MNA or the member of National Assembly. Likewise, a concept of the local government was there in the Indian subcontinent, where there was a central legislative assembly in the center and provincial legislative assemblies for the provinces. In the central legislative assemblies, the seats, reserved seats for the Indians inhabitants was raised from 16 to 60. So Indians were represented in a far larger number as compared to the Indian Consuls Acts of 1862. Number second point is that the seats for provinces were also increased, keeping in view the population of each provinces. It was different from province to province, but they were extended by a large number. Number third and the most important point is that the separate electorate for Muslims was approved. Now there were fixed and reserved seats for Muslim, where there would be a Muslim candidate and only Muslims can vote for him. Fourth number is the distinction between the official and non-official members of the Central Legislative Assembly. Officials would be the civil servants, the civil English civil servant or the Indian civil servants, and the non-officials would be the elective representatives. Point number 5 is the permission granted to the people to raise supplementary questions. Before that, the participants were allowed to ask a question from the Viceroy, but a one-time question. The Viceroy should answer it in his own way, and you cannot ask anything further. But here in the Indian Consul Act, the supplementary questions were allowed. So a kind of discussion on the bill presented was allowed. And the sixth point is the structure of executive councils. In the executive councils maintained directly under the Viceroy, there would be the members of ex-civil servant like William Octavian Hume. Then there would be nominated officials. Nominated officials means the officers who are nominated by the Viceroy and they should have been in the civil services. Then there were nominated non-officials. It means the people selected by the Viceroy for the cabinet. And number 4 would be the elected members. Elected members would be the elites or the businessmen or the landlords, because there was a limited franchise for elections. And now we will discuss the criticism on the Minto-Morley reforms. The first and foremost criticism is that Britishers actually wanted to divide Indians and Muslims, and that is the reason they gave the demand of separate electorate to the Muslims. But this point is not true, because the Muslims did not felt betrayed at the hands of British, but they felt betrayed at the hands of Hindus. And Muslims, they jointly revolted against the British crown in the War of 1857. But later on, when the Britishers chose Hindus to maintain their rule, they equally joined hand with the British to work with the new rulers against Muslims. Now, that is when the seed of this divide and rule policy was sowed. Number second point is that the Indians were not represented in the affairs of the government at all. It was just a narrative that the Britishers are giving more and more autonomy or more and more representation to the people. We can see that what Britishers were doing with Indian subcontinent, it was nothing that can be called as a democracy. The people in the executive councils, they were nominated by the viceroy. It is just like a dictator choosing his own cabinet. So it is not democracy at all. So the last heading that I am going to discuss today is conclusion. Today we have studied that in the aftermath of the War of Independence 1857, the Muslims and Hindus were deliberately divided by the British Crown. They encouraged Hindus more and more and they discouraged the Muslims. Hindus, in spite of standing with their Muslim brethren for whom they were living from past 1100 years, they stood with the new rulers and they were equally responsible for inflicting whatever was being done to the Muslims. Then we have studied that the Indian intellectuals, because of the international scenario and whatever was going on the national forum as well, they felt the need to establish a body that would represent the Indians in the British Parliament. Indians were represented, but not all Indians. The demands of the Muslims, they were not represented as they were required to be. So the Muslims, especially after the year 1905, the Muslims felt that they need to have a separate body to represent their own interests, and in the same year 1906, All India Muslim League was established. And then we have seen the constitutional reforms, the difference between the Council Acts of 1862 and 1909. And then we have studied the criticism. In the next lecture, I would be defining the events that led to another constitutional reforms known as Montagu-Chelmsford Reform of 1919. What happened in these 10 years? The people who have not subscribed to the channel, I would like to say that you must subscribe so whenever the new lecture is uploaded, you might get aware. Thank you very much. Stay blessed. Allah Hafiz.